Welcome to the Minority Report. I'm Boyd Delonzo. On today's show, increased tensions between the U.S. and Russia over an anti-missile defense system in Eastern Europe. And then we'll turn to Africa, where a brighter economic picture appears ahead. Last month, the United States announced that it began talks with the governments of Poland and the Czech Republic to incorporate the two EU nations into the U.S. anti-missile defense system. The announcement has deeply angered Russian officials, who believe the introduction of interceptor missiles into Eastern Europe would pose a direct threat to Russia's security. On February 10th, at a conference on global security in Munich, Russian President Vladimir Putin went as far as to say the United States has overstepped its national borders in every way. He also warned that if missiles were placed in Eastern Europe, then Russia would take the appropriate measures to counter this threat. The Pentagon plan is to develop an advanced radar system in the Czech Republic and 10 interceptor missiles in Poland. If the two former Soviet bloc states agree, then the missiles and radar systems should be fully operational by 2011. The U.S. military says these additional bases are needed to counter the emerging nuclear missile threat from rogue regimes such as Iran and North Korea. Yet many critics believe that expanding these systems into Eastern Europe would do little to reduce the actual threat from a ballistic missile. Bruno Grussel, a research specialist at the Paris-based Strategic Research Foundation, said, "It is true that for intercontinental missiles fired from the Middle East, the shortest way to reach Washington or New York passes over Central Europe." But he added to this by saying, the U.S. military already has radar stations in Norway, Greenland, and in Britain that permit the early detection of missiles wherever they come from. This fact has led many to believe that the real reason behind the proposed missile and radar sites in Eastern Europe is part of a broad American plan to achieve nuclear primacy over America's nuclear rivals. Nuclear primacy is when a state has achieved a clear nuclear advantage that would enable it to carry out a nuclear first strike against a rival state without facing a significant risk of retaliation. If the U.S. were to achieve this, many fear it would lead to an even more aggressive foreign policy based on the Bush doctrine of unilateralism and preemption. American officials say that this is neither the intention nor policy of the United States. They point to the fact that it is impossible for these missiles to pose a threat to Russia because Russia's nuclear arsenal is so vast that it could easily overwhelm the small missile defense system of 10 interceptor missiles. While this may be true, Russians fear that the Americans could easily increase the amount of missiles placed in the region over time. In response to this perceived threat, Russian General Nikolai Solotov warned the governments of Poland and the Czech Republic that if they agree to host the U.S. missile defense bases, then they risk being targeted by Russian missiles. Despite the Russian threat, it is likely that both Czech Prime Minister Mirek Topolánek and Polish Prime Minister Jaroslaw Kaczynski will allow the American bases. This is also despite the fact that a clear majority of their populations are against the establishment of the bases in their countries. A survey conducted in Poland last year revealed that around two-thirds of Poles are against the housing of all or part of the U.S. anti-missile defense system. And in the Czech Republic last Sunday, hundreds of citizens were protesting against the same issue in the capital of Prague. Czech Prime Minister Mirek Topolánek said that he considered Russia's fears to be absurd, and that the Russians will eventually have an anti-missile defense system as well. Critics say that Russia's fears are largely due to the complete lack of consultation prior to the announcement of the anti-missile defense system's location last month. This served to only deepen the growing level of mistrust that Russia feels towards the West. Russians see this as yet another attempt by the West to try and isolate Russia and to limit its power in the region that it historically considers to be part of its sphere of influence. At the conference in Munich, Putin reminded his audience that the Soviet Union was guaranteed that no NATO expansion would occur into Eastern Europe. Since that time, the NATO alliance has expanded to include a large portion of the former Soviet bloc. Additionally, attempts to court Georgia and Ukraine into the NATO alliance further add to Russia's fears and mistrust. Much of the recent rhetoric and geopolitical maneuvering has reminded many of the days of the Cold War. The U.S. has not only been steadily moving into Eastern Europe, but has also established military bases in other regions around Russia's periphery, such as in Central Asia and the Caucasus. The U.S. is particularly active in support for the country of Georgia, where Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia often clash with American-trained and equipped Georgian soldiers. Last September, a helicopter carrying the Georgian defense minister was fired upon on the same day that U.S. Senator and presidential candidate John McCain was touring South Ossetia by helicopter. This example demonstrates how an international incident could easily drag the U.S. and Russia into conflict in one of these hotspots around the world. The increased tensions led to American and Russian officials to meet in Moscow on Thursday, where they acknowledged some of their main concerns and agreed to work closely together to overcome them. Whether the joint statement was just rhetoric or a genuine agreement that increased tensions served neither state's interest is yet to be seen. But in the words of Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, one Cold War is enough.